Okay. 7 minutes. We'll begin on my first word. Resolution. The European Central Bank should cease interest rate increases until at least the end of 2024. We'd like to provide a critical challenge to the assumption of the resolution and the resolution framework. A point under this is a framework. Subpoint A. Fiat is illusory. We are not policymakers and most won't be. We are academics and learners who need to realize that all we gain in the round is the education we get from our rhetoric and our discourse. Subpoint B. The rhetoric we use and the assumptions behind it are the most important thing that gives us access to education in the round. Subpoint C. Patriarchy is at the root of the idea that we can control that which we perceive as weaker than we are. Early in the history of people, patriarchy was an early tool of toxic masculinity. It caused men to believe that women could be controlled as property, and their bodies were nothing more than commodities for consumption, and their only value in society was their ability to provide service to a man. D point. An example is that 1/3 of women in the world will experience gender-based violence in their lifetime. E point. Patriarchal power structures such as the European Central Bank use the mindset of patriarchy to control that which they perceive as weaker. For example, the separate member nations that have to comply to any patriarchal policies such as the resolution. F point. We should spend this round challenging rhetorical assumptions because bad methodology breeds bad policy. So, B point under this is the links. Subpoint A. Resolution uses patriarchal power structures such as the European Central Bank. Subpoint B. Resolution forces us to use patriarchal terms such as banking, centralized authority, and the power of dictating personal freedom in the form of interest rates. Subpoint C. The European centralized banks, like many other economic institutions, has been historically dominated by men. Additionally, the bank's focus on inflation targeting, which has been a central part of its mandate since its establishment, is a gendered policy that reinforces traditional gender roles. Inflation targeting is primarily concerned with maintaining price stability, which benefits certain groups over others. D. It operates under a fiat framework, which assumes patriarchal power structures can wave a magic wand to get what they want from something they perceive as weaker and controllable in the negation world. E. The res operates under the assumption that might makes right, and this is what we have to challenge. So, C point under this is impacts. A. This perpetuates dehumanization by saying that some people are weaker than others. B. The resolution emboldens patriarchy, which is the root cause of sexism, racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and vulture capitalism. C. By not challenging the rhetorical assumptions of the resolution, they only serve as tools of patriarchal oppression. D. This is the cause of death and assault. E. Environmental destruction. Patriarchal structures are the cause of environmental destruction because the might makes right mentality and control are how people have justified environmental degradation. This is the root cause of climate change, and without challenging these root causes, we will be confronted with global extinction, which outweighs any other argument they make. D point is the alternative text. Vote F to reject the traditional fiat debate frameworks, positioning in the patriarchal power relations, and rethink gender hierarchy in the sphere of international relations. A. By challenging the root causes of control and dehumanization, we solve by using the ballot as a symbolic gesture to rethink our rhetoric. B. When we rethink the structures we operate under and the rhetoric we use, we will ultimately create a world void of toxic masculinity, environmental destruction, sexual assault, and racism. C. We break down barriers of fear to engage in dialogue to eliminate dehumanizing ideologies like racism and sexism. D. The judge should use their ballot to demonstrate that the resolution is validating patriarchal structures and that as academics and learners, we have a responsibility to the future to challenge rhetorical violence. E. Vote for the alt text for a fair and equal challenge to the rhetoric behind this round. Thank you.
All right, perfect. So let's go ahead and get started. I have an 8-minute speech.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Just give me 1 second. All right, Judge. So before I begin, my name is Vishal Krishan. I'm going to be the first and third speaker for the round today. I use he, him pronouns, and I'll let my partner introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Priya, and I use she, her pronouns, and I will be the second speaker.
Fantastic. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and begin. I have an 8-minute speech. If you guys have any POIs, just feel free to verbalize. All right. Are my partner ready? Opponents ready? And judge ready?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right, perfect. So let's just get straight into this. Essentially, the government side of this debate proposes a critique. They argue that we have academic education. They tend to critique the topic. They say that it's inherently patriarchal. They argue this whole might makes might, that by supporting the resolution and giving into inherent fiat and traditional fiat, we're essentially using a patriarchal power structure and the tools of patriarchal destruction. Let's talk about homophobia, racism, sexism, etc. But I'm going to touch upon a few things. So if they want to talk about the actual education that we come from debate, I'd like to first start off by saying like parliamentary is not inherently a critique-based debate. It's inherently based off of logic by using pre-structured structured, critique-based cases are inherently violating the educational aspects that come with parliamentary debate. It's a logic-based debate inherently. It is not supposed to be with computer online prep. So by using pre-prepped critique cases, they are inherently violating the basics and intrinsic of parliamentary debate and violating the logic that comes with parliamentary debate. As much as they'd like to say that they're Lincoln Douglas debaters and policy debaters, this is not Lincoln Douglas or policy debate. By using Lincoln Douglas and policy debate, they're inherently taking rounds and taking material from other circuits in order to bring it into the parliamentary circuit to establish dominance, using it for their own personal profit or their own personal gain. Essentially, by using critique things, you shouldn't even value that in the round because they're clearly not parliamentary debaters and they're exploiting parliamentary debaters for their own success by using pre-written critique cases which technically aren't even allowed in parliamentary. Let's move on. Let's talk about the fact that they talk about how they claim to solve homophobia and transphobia, but our opponents are inherently homophobic and transphobic. Their first speaker didn't even state their pronouns before beginning that. We're not supposed to do that by enabling transphobia and homophobia by not stating their pronouns. They inherently contribute to that. They can't argue that they stop patriarchy. They can't argue against a patriarchal society when they inherently promote homophobia and transphobia. They can't come back and be like, no, we don't, because literally they started off by not saying their pronouns in the round. They're going to run a whole critique about how we're promoting patriarchy, how the resolution inherently does so. They failed to state the pronouns in their very first speech. They're inherently contributing to homophobia and transphobia, and especially telling the idea that we're promoting transphobia or we're promoting patriarchy and the topic and the resolution proposes patriarchy to a team of literally a man and a woman is inherently sexist. But the fact of the matter is they don't even know that because again, they don't ask for pronouns. They don't provide their own pronouns for all we know. Let's go ahead and move on to the fact that inherently the EU is the leader in gender equality in the world, and the president of the European Central Bank is literally a woman. By arguing against the EU and say the ECB is inherently patriarchal, they effectively discriminate against all forms and they basically mitigate all forms of gender equality that they fall into. The ECB and the EU is the leading global power in gender equality and in combating sexism and gender discrimination. So for them to come in here and say that EU is inherently patriarchal and it's inherently sexist, sure it is, but all institutions are. But also they say by not addressing the resolution, essentially what they're doing is they're enabling more inflation, which disproportionately affects women. Women are more likely to be, they have single mom families. More women are more likely to be low income families, especially single moms. By not addressing the resolution tax, they're inherently contributing to sexism and directly attacking single moms and low income moms by not addressing the resolution tax. I also remind you again, this is not parliamentary debate. This is not the education that comes from parliamentary debate. It's quite ironic that their first speaker like to come in here acting all elitist and say we're here for education, when in fact, first of all, they're discriminating and taking away the education of parliamentary debate because it's not a critique-based debate. It's not a pre-prepped case debate, which in fact violates the rules of the NPDL. It's clearly crazy they say that. But again, they're violating the academics of parliamentary debate. With that being said, let's just go on. I'm going to talk about our case a little bit and get onto that because I'm going to talk about a little bit on case. Let's talk about some definitions about the European Central Bank, aka the ACB, is the prime component of the Euro system and the European system of central banks, as well as one of 7 institutions of the European Union. It's one of the world's most important central banks. Second, the interest rate is a fixed interest rate, determines the conditions when commercial banks borrow money from or invest money with the central banks. In general, low-key interest rates stimulate the economy, while higher interest rates tend to slow it down. Observation 1, across Europe, prices for energy, groceries, and services are rising. According to Eurostat, the annual inflation rate increased to 9.9% in the Eurozone, a new record high. What the government essentially does is inherently, by not addressing the resolution tax and enabling inflation to go on high, they're inherently targeting women themselves and pursuing a patriarchal society in which women do not have the ability to gain economic freedom, to get independence from abusive husbands, and get out of gender violence. They're inherently perpetuating that and perpetuating the harmful gender stereotypes that exist in our world. Again, they ignore the fact that the literal president of the ECB is literally women. So by saying her decisions are inherently patriarchal, they are silencing women voices. The very few women leaders we have in this world, they are inherently silencing women voices. The government side of this debate is inherently homophobic and transphobic. 1, by not providing your pronouns. 2, inherently patriarchal themselves and is exploiting women in power, exploiting their actions for their own benefit. And is 3, exploiting parliamentary debate for their own successes as LD or policy debaters. And by 4, by undermining the educational access of parliamentary debate by not sticking to the philosophical and theoretical debate meetings of parliamentary debate. Let's get into our first contention for today, which is that it mitigates inflation and stabilizes the economy. Low interest rates lead to a larger money supply and accelerates the circulation of money. In this situation, every euro is worth less than inflation increases. Conversely, a higher interest rate can slow down inflation. With less money available in the market, every single euro increases in value. Consumer prices fall and therefore inflation decreases. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the ECB has gradually lowered the key interest rate to 0% in order to promote economic growth. Even during the coronavirus pandemic, a low key interest rate was meant to boost the economy. For most of the past decade, inflation in the euro area was below the ECB's target of 2%. Let's go and talk about how Basically, Russia's aggressive war in Ukraine and the related energy crisis have fueled inflation since early 2022. And the year area inflation reached 9.9% in June 22, 5 times the ECB targets to hit the break and slow down inflation. The ECB is now taking restrictive measures like raising the key interest rate. As the ECB reduces the amount of money in circulation by raising interest rates, the value of the euro increases. And because it's a strong incentive to save money, consumers spend less, which reduces demand. Inflation is projected to remain too high for too long, Miss Lagarde says, adding that the move was needed to ensure the timely return of the inflation to the bank 2% target. The bank staff has forecast that inflation will average 5.3% this year and still be slightly above the 2% target in 2025. Should a pause happen, for example, in the US, now Fed meeting, global equities likely tumbled 3 to 5%. We also talk about it prevents decrease in public confidence. Some observers have emphasized that a pause in interest hike rates could be interpreted as central banks fearing for the health of the banking system, which might have undermined trust in banks further. But a pause would also raise an even more important median turn. Yielding demand sayings of Biden's trouble could imply giving up on the fight against inflation. Let's overall, we have to see that the impact of pausing interest rate hikes overall, like the affirmation claim that they solve, overall targets targets women, targets minority women, targets low income women, targets single mothers by not giving them the ability, by succumbing to inflation and not directly actively working to overturn the patriarchal society. They are contributing to it. The big part of patriarchal society is that women do not have the financial independence to break out of gender norms and break the patriarchal society they live in. They inherently are stuck in a system which they do not have enough money to get freedom to take care of their children, take care of themselves. By supporting inflation and not addressing the resolution text, the government side of this debate inherently supports patriarchal society by not giving women the means to get out of abusive situation, to get out of domestic households. I'd also like to add that inherently with the what the opposition doing again by not providing ways for us to access PYs, for not providing at the beginning of the round, giving access to it by telling us how they like to verbalize PYs and giving PYs. Again, they're limiting the education aspect of the parliamentary if we want to go to that sector. But again, I'd like to remind you that parliamentary, as I need to re-emphasize, parliament debate is not a critique debate. It's not a pre-written K debate. It's about the philosophical and logical arguments. It is not based on pre-prep. There wasn't even interpret prep around the traditional parliamentary debate. So by operating off the rules of critiques and going off by critiquing the planned topic, they are not adhering to the traditional rules of parliamentary debate. They are inherently violating the educational basis of parliamentary debate and limiting the educational aspect that is offered to both me and my partner, a male and a female, who one, are inherently not homophobic and transphobic like my opponents are, since we provided our pronouns at the beginning of debate, but also to brown men and women who inherently face discrimination at larger rates, and in brown communities where we are more likely, especially women, to face single women, to face more difficulties in terms of economic access. So overall, you have to vote on a few key aspects. The government team has already lost this debate because they are clearly exploiting patriarchal society. By not providing the pronouns, they inherently contribute to patriarchal society and contribute to homophobia and transphobia. By arguing by using a pre-written K debate and pre-written K debate, they argue against and they violate the educational aspect of parliamentary debate. By not addressing the resolution text, they perpetuate a patriarchal society by not giving women the access and ability to get out of gender roles, out of patriarchal society, out of domestic abuse, and out of economic instability. So for all those reasons, I strongly urge a negation ballot, and there's no way in the world that they've already started that you can vote for the government side. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Before I begin, Judge, just everyone ready? And then I'll begin my time.
Yeah, all good.
Okay, so my 8 minutes will begin now. So Judge, first of all, coming into this round, obviously this debate got very heated, but let's look at the line by line. As the critique is the most important thing in the round, anything on case said is solved through our critique, as you should vote for all text, and as the neg does not provide you another alt text or anything else for you to vote on. So moving on, let's talk about first thing they talk about not stating our pronouns, so on and so forth, and how this is unpredictable, and so on and so forth. Judge, first of all, not stating your pronouns does not mean that we're homophobic or we're instigating this. I might not feel comfortable stating my pronouns or choices and how I feel about them. You cannot force your beliefs on top of mine. That just you just link into our critique of patriarchy to begin with. Just because you feel so confident about your parliamentary debate skills doesn't mean you have to force them onto us. What gives you the right to deem us not parliamentary debaters? How do you know anything about us? Have you researched us up? You have no right to deem us not parliamentary debaters and using this pre-written critique or use this from internet prep. In this tournament, in the equity briefing that we should have all attended to begin with, we are allowed to use internet prep. If we found this critique online, that is within the rights of parliamentary debate or this tournament, just this tournament to begin with, for us to use this critique. However, you cannot assume this on us or put a label on us simply because you feel like you've been put into not a winning position. One, this is a hurtful these hurtful and inaccurate labels such as claiming that we are both homophobic by not stating our pronouns. That's just defamation to begin with. And two, you link to this case by simply stating that we're homophobic. What gives you the right as a person to claim to put a label on us, homophobic to begin with? That is very insulting and inaccurate label. So again, you just link it to your own critique. Critiques are within the bounds of parliamentary debate. Again, you have no idea what debate we've done in the past, what debate or what background we come from. You have no right to make the assumption that we have not done parliamentary debate before, or have not run critiques from in the parliamentary debate. Critique is what makes parliamentary debate fun and interesting. Running a critique from the AF is breaking the traditions of running one from the neg, and that is what we're doing. We're trying to set this example, trying to set the precedence of running a critique from the affirmation side as the first speaker to challenge the rhetoric of the resolution. You could just come here claiming how insulting and claiming how we're homophobic. That does not respond to the critique. That only links you yourself into our critique of talking about how the system, how the world and system of society is inherently patriarchal. And what is the negation solution, Judge? Simply shut up and deal about it, or insult us back. They claim how all institutions are patriarchal. So again, this just links into the critique of how the negation is basically telling us to shut up and deal with patriarchy. They're linking to their own argument. Again, patriarchy. This critique argument is not unique to you. You have a coach. You obviously have internet access as well. You obviously come from a debate program that can afford the entry fees. You obviously have a broadband and a computer. Hence, you carry the juice to have a full response of a critique debate. It is the negation's job to carry the weight of this round, and to come up with any and basically have the ground to do anything they like. The net cannot claim that we're unpredictable by running this critique, by us somehow using a pre-written critique or a internet prepped critique, which is entirely false. It proves that we have to pass to alternate text, Judge. The neg has not even thought about or challenging the rhetoric behind the resolution of using the European Central Bank as a institution, which abides by the path of patriarchy. Now, moving on, the K goes mostly unresponded to. Again, our K is not unique. It's not don't let the negation come in here claiming how this is internet prep, how it's not within the rules of party, Judge. Your experience, Judge. Critiques are well within the rules of parliamentary debate, and we can run this critique. The negation can come in here, either challenge the framework, which they don't do, find something worse than patriarchy, that in the root cause, which they don't do. They only further insult us and put labels on us of how we're homophobic. That's just defamation. The neg can also argue that the neg action is a performative action of the K, which they do not, Judge. These are all avenues of what the neg can do, and what they do when they come up here and debate us. They simply insult us and put labels which are not true on us, Judge. That's a vote against them. One, they have violated the equity briefing of this tournament. Two, they have just defamed our names, defamed this entire round, taking out the education out of this round. This is an emotionally charged round. Like as you can see, as you have heard from the first speaker, Judge, all they want to do is basically put labels on us, claim how we have not established our pronouns in my partner's first speech, and use this as a knife to go against us, Judge. Ultimately, advocacy is in the vacuum. The neg is responsible for the entirety of their argument, and their argument is basically to insult us individually as debaters. The resolution is a springboard for discussion, but not the 10 Commandments. We don't have to abide by the resolution. What the resolution asks is exactly what to do. We can challenge the rhetoric behind the resolution, which is what the affirmation is doing. Again, Judge, I provided you 3 avenues of what the neg can do to have a fair and educational debate on the rhetoric of the resolution, none of which they choose. They've only chosen to insult us and put defamatory labels on our names. Moving on, extending me and my partner's critique as the on case, as the critique, as the alternative text, which my partner has stated. I'll state once again: is vote after reject the traditional fiat debate framework, positioning in patriarchal power relations, and rethink the gender hierarchy in the sphere of international relations. Vote the alternative. Vote the alt text, Judge, as without analyzing the critique through this rhetorical lens, will not solve for anything that the negation claims in their on case contention, which is slowing down inflation, all the impacts that flow under their on case debate, Judge. Without looking at without analyzing the rhetoric of this debate, without analyzing the sexism, racism, homophobia beneath the rhetoric of this resolution, we cannot achieve what the negation is hoping to do so through their on case debate. Hence, you should vote for the alt text, Judge. Use your ballot as Use your ballot to demonstrate the resolution is validating patriarchal structures, and as us as academics and learners, we have a responsibility for the future to challenge the rhetorical violence. Again, going on to rhetorical violence, Judge. Again, this just proves how the negation is linking into our critique. They use rhetorical violence as a means to get what they want, to simply get a win, and not debate the educational rhetoric behind the language used in the resolution. Judge, rhetorical violence. This is one of the things that we're trying to solve through the alternative text. However, the neg side has clearly shown that they can't even use simple and civilized language to debate the discourse and education behind this round. Judge, for all these reasons above, for the critique, for the alt text, at which again the neg, I've given 3 avenues which the neg can respond on and can have a fair and educational debate on, which they do not. Judge, for all these reasons and the rhetorical violence and the defamatory label being put on me and my partner, I strongly urge for a vote and the affirmation. Thank you.
Okay, is everybody ready?
All good.
Okay. My time will start now. Judge, we're going to only focus on off case right now. We'll talk about the critique, and then if there's time, I'll go into the case because we win on the case and we win on the critique, and I'll prove to you why. So first, let's talk about their link. Their link is false. They don't access the patriarchy because, first of all, the EU is a leader in gender inequality and combating sexism with multiple leaders that are considered women. And not only that, but the president of the European Central Bank is actually a woman. So the fact that they're demeaning this and calling this a system of patriarchy, and while there are influences of patriarchy in every single business, the fact that they decided to pick solely on the one that has a woman in power shows how they only want to bring down companies that have women in power and claim that it's for the patriarchy. But how do we know that's really why? How do we know that it's not because they don't care about the fact that one patriarchal system has actually put a woman into a place of power, and that is the system that they are actually deciding to target instead of any of the other patriarchal systems that exist within our world. Now let's move on to the second argument. Second of all, having the EU as an innate patriarchal actor is no different than any other actor that exists in the status quo. If we go with this concept, our opponents are essentially stating that there should never be any movement and policies in the world. They're saying that we shouldn't move through with any policies, with any kind of structure. They don't provide an alternative, a different kind of body that doesn't have patriarchal, that is not influenced by the patriarchy to go with instead, which means that they're saying that we should not have any kind of body, any political entity, any organization to ever go through with bringing out policies in the world. So they don't think that we should move forward. So they instead want us to reverse back into the historical situation where women were oppressed and where women did not have rights, so that instead of like the status quo, because they are completely anti moving forward in society and moving forward to a time when women can have more rights. So instead they prefer us moving back into society when I as a woman would lose my rights, where I wouldn't be able to be at the debate, where I wouldn't be able to speak, because they don't want to move forward with the patriarchal society that we have. So third of all, by ignoring the passage of policies, they also completely disregard the fact that women, specifically single mothers, are more likely to be disproportionately affected by the inflation occurring right now in the EU, promoting a world where women are forced to be reliant on their male counterparts to create money. Women are disproportionately affected by inflation due to the fact that they most often have kids that they have to go home to take care of, that they can't go out and buy grocery foods, and that they don't receive as much aid as other people do. In addition to this, they're more likely to be considered single mothers. There's more single mothers than there are single fathers, which means they have to take care of their entire family. They have to work a single job where they're not going to get paid as much, where their gas is going to be too low that they can't drive their kids to school. But our opponents are sitting here talking about how we should be focused on how the institution that is going to resolve these problems is a patriarchal institution, completely disregarding the fact that the patriarchy is not just institution, it's in every part of our life. If we want to actually resolve the institution, if we actually want to resolve the patriarchy, then my opponent should have provided an alternative that would actually bring about some kind of change. But my opponents provided no alternative, no solution, which means we have to stick with the status quo, and either we're moving forward in society or we're moving backward. And if we move backward, we're only going to get deeper into the patriarchy, because if anything, especially the EU has been the driving factor in how society has moved out of this. In addition to this, they perpetuate domestic violence by condoning inflation, because when the economy is suffering, women find it harder to get jobs and end up relying on husbands that are abusive and unsafe for themselves. When we're in an unsafe economic climate, that means that women are unable, when we're in an unstable economic climate, women are more likely to rely on their domestic counterparts because they need money, because they need security, and they need somewhere to keep their kids safe. And that means that our opponents are perpetuating this kind of domestic violence mindset where women feel the need to always rely on the men around them because they don't have the ability to get out there and get their own jobs. In addition to this, the increase in rise in inflation has reduced the amount of jobs available, and women are less likely to be hired than men are. In addition to this, women are likely to take any jobs that they can get. And as we can see, our opponents are already arguing about how there's a patriarchal institution, how the the European Central Bank is a patriarchal institution. Well, what about the fact that you're forcing so many women to go and get a job under a man who might sexually assault them, over a man that might take advantage of them simply because they need to go home, make money, and feed their children? You're completely ignoring the fact that this topic has implications that are greater than just this ideological argument you want to make about the patriarchy that you don't even solve for. In addition to this, once again, Judge, you simply just cannot vote in the critique because they don't have a factual alternative, Judge. If you look at it, in their first speech, I never heard an alternative provided by opponents. Even if they did provide an alternative, it was never extended by their second speaker. Without an alternative, you have nothing to vote on. They claim all these things. They claim all these impacts of solving for the patriarchy, but Judge, in a critique, the only way you can access your impacts is if you provide an alternative to the status quo or an alternative to the policy. Their only alternative is that you should be submitting your ballot and that's going to overturn patriarchy. But first of all, that's a savior complex because you as, if you are a man, if you consider yourself to be a man, that you're only perpetuating the patriarchy and the savior complex where men are going to suddenly solve patriarchy by signing a ballot and that it's a savior complex over them over women. But second of all, that doesn't actually resolve anything because this ballot is never going to get out into the real world and just you condoning it doesn't change anything. My partner and I both condone the patriarchy. Are we really solving anything? No, because you need to go through policy making, and the only way to go through policy making is to go through these institutions and bring about reforms as you go. So we propose that for the Central European Union, for the European Central Bank, that as we go through with the European Central Bank and go through with this policy, that we can bring about reforms in the patriarchy, especially because the president of this company is a woman who speaks out about women's rights and is a supporter of equality. So first of all, yeah, exactly. The fact they don't have an alternative, you have nothing to vote on. If you're really going to vote that your ballot is worth more and that your ballot has the ability to solve for the patriarchy, then Judge, I just simply can't agree with that. Now, I'd like to point out how they actually even link back to their own case, which means you have to drop them as well. They just assumed simply that we have a coach and that we were having a coach that was going to be able to help us prep, which ties right back into their own critique, because given that we actually come from a smaller school that doesn't have any advisors and no teachers or coaches or people that we pay for, is inherently elitist by assuming our socioeconomic backgrounds and the fact that we don't actually have access to the coach because of the fact that we come from a smaller school and the fact that we don't have someone at school who's being paid to teach us about debate and things like this. And their complete assumption that we had some kind of like background or some ability to get access to this information during our prep time is just completely false. They're linking back straight into their critique by assuming people's backgrounds. Now let's move on to the other arguments that our opponents made about the line by line, where my partner brought up about the fact how they were inherently homophobic or transphobic by not stating the pronouns. We're not stating that you actually had to physically state your pronouns, but first of all, you should have been willing to ask us about ours before the beginning, and we never said you had to state them, but you can always decline to say your pronouns, which is completely acceptable. But the reason why this is so important is because because LGBTQ members have so often, specifically in the debate community and the debate space, like my partner and I have constantly been silenced over the fact that people like completely ignore it. Like there's not a comfortable space for us to actually speak out about our own personal identities. It's never a welcoming space for us to talk up about your personal preferences and your personal opinions. So the fact is that we should be comfortable. If we are comfortable enough, we should ask each other to talk about our pronouns, or we should ask each other to put them, say them verbally, because then it creates a more inviting environment for all types of debaters from all different kinds of backgrounds and all different kinds of communities. Because if we only do this on a time by time basis, then it allows us to like perpetuate this idea of where we can target specifically trans and LGBTQ plus members. In addition to this, being homophobic or transphobic is not just an insult, as our opponents claimed it to be. They claimed that we were simply just insulting them. But calling someone homophobic or transphobic has a heavier burden, and it has to do with not understanding the impact of your actions. So the fact of the matter is that our opponents could have simply acknowledged the fact that, yeah, maybe what they could have done could have made it more comfortable. Maybe they could have acknowledged that they might have made a mistake and that maybe they should have asked us what our pronouns were, that maybe they should have done that, and they could have done that and rectified their problems. But this is the same thing that is reflected within their critique. They aren't trying to actually rectify any of their problems. They're simply taking advantage of the patriarchy and the women that are suffering right now under domestic violence so that they can win a debate because they think that that's what's going to bring it to them. But they never once actually mentioned the women who are suffering at the hands of the patriarchy, the people who are suffering from domestic violence, and never even bothered to respond to any of our arguments about how women are being affected, proving that they're only using this for their own personal gain in the debate. And for all these reasons, I strongly urge a negation ballot. Thank you.
Sorry, guys, we're just setting our timer with us. Okay, perfect. All right, so I have a 4-minute speech. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So are my opponents ready? Judge ready?
I'm all good. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and begin in 3, 2, 1. So just to jump straight into this fact, the fact of the matter is the government team lost this debate the first time they started speaking without stating their pronouns. They say that this is something of personal preference, They didn't want to say their pronouns. They didn't want to say anything. But the fact of the matter is they didn't acknowledge it whatsoever. When we called them out on it as 2 queer people on a team together, when we called them out on it, they refused to rectify the situation, refused to apologize, and simply said, that's our right. The issue of the matter is, yes, it's your right, but you can't claim that you're solving homophobia and transphobia and then not say your pronouns, an inherently patriarchal act. The idea of patriarchy is rooted in the fact that people assume gender, they don't go on to say their pronouns, or they don't acknowledge it whatsoever. They ignore all of that, especially saying that the 2 queer people on a team, the fact of the matter is they are inherently homophobic and transphobic, not only because they didn't say their pronouns, but they didn't even apologize for it, didn't apologize to 2 queer people, and they're inherently silencing the voices of 2 queer people by not dropping this debate immediately. Let's go and talk about the fact that they inherently call the ECB, the European Central Bank, patriarchal, but they don't solve any of the impacts. Like my opponent said, they don't have an alternative. If they don't provide an alternative, they inherently argue against every single patriarchal thing. Let's perhaps apply that to the U.S. government. The U.S. government proposed the 19th Amendment to give women the right to vote under a patriarchal society. They're essentially arguing that the U.S. should not have given the women the right to vote because they're a patriarchal institution. And any progress that is made under a patriarchal institution is automatically patriarchal. They advocate for a time thousands of years ago, which we had no bodies, which we live in a patriarchal society. They advocate against the voting rights of women. If they're going to advocate against all patriarchal organizations, they advocate against every single change, every single progressive movement that's ever happened in the entire world, because patriarchy is rooted in every single element of our round. And the fact of the matter is, they're perpetuating patriarchy in this own round once again by not exploring the gender spectrum, by not asking 2 queer members for their own pronoun, by refusing to apologize, and by literally arguing about patriarchy to a team that has a man and a woman, both of which are queer members. They can't win on that point. They ignore every single impact we talked about women. They can't come up here in their 3rd speech and address any of the impacts we brought up. They don't address the fact they actually perpetuate patriarchy by enabling inflation. They don't address single mothers. They don't address low-income people. They don't address minorities. They don't address queer people. They don't address any of that. They come up here and say that we're insulting them, but the fact of the matter is they insulted us directly. Their second speaker says, and I quote, "You guys probably have a coach." The fact of the matter is they are assuming our socioeconomic impact and our ability just based on our looks and our background, which, as they like to say, is a violation of the equity briefing. You are not allowed to comment on socioeconomic standings. So by saying that we have a coach is inherently elitist and perpetuates the elitism that happens in debate. No, we don't have a coach. We come from a team that recently started their debate program last year without any coach. So to come here and say that we should be prepped for this debate because we have a coach and we should be able to respond to critiques is inherently elitist and perpetuates the idea that private academies with coach are inherently always going to be better than public schools, than small schools without adequate coaching. In fact, if you actually cared about socioeconomic, if you actually cared about dropping by the patriarchy, judge, this team would have dropped the round when they realized that we came from a small school on a team with 1 man and woman on 2 queer members. They haven't done any of that. We tell you that in fact the fact of the matter is the government team does not care about homophobia. They don't care about racism. They don't care about transphobia. They don't care about patriarchy, because if they did, they would have answered all the issues we brought up. They would have talked about the on case. They would have talked about the resolution, because the resolution disproportionately affects women and perpetuates patriarchal society. If they cared, they wouldn't have made socioeconomic assumptions, which is against the equity briefing, and they wouldn't have assumed that we have a coach, and they wouldn't perpetuate elitism in debate. If they actually cared, they wouldn't come up here and not take the pronouns and then continue to defend themselves, even when they did something that's homophobic and transphobic. Inherently, the government team is using this all for exploitation. It is clear as day. The fact of the matter is they could have apologized and said, sorry, we don't feel comfortable sharing our pronouns, but we should have asked, or we should have said we wanted to solve homophobia, but they didn't. The exploitation is evident. We ask you to reject our opponents as your form of preventing the use of arguments on real issues for personal gain. And for all these reasons, I not just urge you, I beg you to vote negation. Thank you.
Okay, I have a 5-minute speech coming up, brief off-time rollout. I'm just going to talk about, what happened in the round. Like, if there's any issues with anything pronoun related, I'll be sure to clarify that, and I'll just go through the line by line. Right. So 5 minutes begins on my first word. Like, first, before like I really go on to the actual debate and what happened, right? If there's any issue with pronouns, it's an issue for the equity team that has no links to education and discord of the round. Again, we respect your pronouns. We're sorry if you were offended in any way. And yeah, but like we generally want to focus on what happened in the round, and this is an issue for the equity team, and extend my partner's response to that as well. Again, we respect your privacy for your pronouns, hence we don't want to invade your privacy. If you bring up your pronouns, we can respect them. But hey, you labeling us homophobic and transphobic with no evidence, but the fact just based on the fact that we didn't state our pronoun, just like I feel slightly offended, but that's okay. That's not the general issue here. Like, now just going like down the line by line, we see what the neg has stated toward RK. We see that they talk about how like a main issue here that they seem to emphasize is that the low income single mothers being unfairly affected. However, if we don't discuss this case, they are victims of the patriarchal system. We were basically told that we had to work within the system. That's not how it works, Judge. Like, basically throughout this whole round, they like my opponents give counter examples of women in high positions of power. Like, for example, the women who are working in the European Union and like the leader of the European Centralized Bank. Even so, like I acknowledge the fact that there are women who are in these leadership positions, but even so, this idea of oppression and control with member states in the European Union that have to comply with the bank's policies, that have to comply with these interest rate policies, is why this is such a big problem, because they're basically under the neg world. They're basically being told to be quiet and deal with the system, right? And this is inherently patriarchal, and this is what we're trying to deconstruct, right? Like, talk about they give an example of voting rights, right? And how the US like supported voting rights, and how we're basically saying no, that's a bad thing. No, we're not saying that this is bad, but the US only gave women rights because this rhetoric was challenged, right? Because like historical precedents, historical oppression was being challenged, just like what we are doing in this round today, right? And like they talk about how women are being disproportionately affected under our plan. However, the same would occur if we don't challenge the rhetoric of an inherently patriarchal institution. And then like they talk about how we don't provide any real world alternatives. However, we've clearly stated many times, or like in my speech, sorry, that the alternative text, we talk about voting after to reject the traditional fiat debate framework, positioning in the patriarchal power relations, and to rethink gender hierarchy in the sphere of international relations. If my opponents didn't flow that, that's on them. But we clearly stated this, and this should be on your flow, Judge. Right? Like, without challenging this rhetoric, like, vote for the alternative text, because it's a symbolic gesture that we challenge this rhetoric, right? And while challenging this rhetoric, every impact mentioned by the neg speaker will still occur without challenging this rhetoric. And the neg cannot just sever this rhetoric, which is a link to the criticism. Yet another link to the case is that the neg assumes their action, their performative action of the criticism, when they haven't even rejected these patriarchal structures yet. When they tell us that they have we have to work within the system to be able to deconstruct it, which is clearly inherently patriarchal. And at the end of the day, we have alt text, and that is the only tangible thing for anyone to vote on in this round. And there's no text of competition for our alt text, which leads out to all our impacts about deconstructing harmful stereotypes, about deconstructing and rethinking gender hierarchy in the sphere of international relations. Thank you.
All right, just give me a few minutes to type up my stuff, and then I'll disclose and all that.
Thank you so much, Judge.
All right, thank you guys for waiting.
Yeah, of course.
All right. I will actually turn on my camera for this now that it's disclosure because my internet is hopefully not as bad. So hopefully we're all good. All right, cool. Sweet. Thank you guys for the debate. I'll start off by saying that I'm going to use my disclosure as more of an opportunity for everyone to learn a little more about how to handle Ks and how to run them and stuff. Because, I mean, like, let's be honest, I'm sure for all four of you, this round was to some extent unpleasant for, I'm sure, everyone involved. And we obviously, you know, want to have positive experiences coming out of debate. And at no point do I feel like anyone should be, at no point do I feel like anyone should like have distress caused based on an argument by the other team. So I'm going to hopefully walk through, explain what we can do for both sides, and at the very least learn something from this. Also, because this round kind of sucked emotionally for everyone, I just gave you all 30s just cause, you know, at least we can walk away with something, you know. But all right, let's talk about this. So first off, one interesting aspect before I even jump into the K, I feel like, is the discussion of Ks being in parley debate. Now, obviously, the neg brings up that Ks should not be in parley debate, and the AF inherently disagrees because they ran a K, which we all get. But yeah, but in terms of Ks like being allowed in parley or not, personally, I come from a like circuit, well, national circuit, but they run Ks all the time. So I don't necessarily think that Ks inherently do not belong in parley, but I do think there's an interesting spot for discussion there because I will admit parley is an event that is dying because of the introduction of critiques in the space. We have never seen parley been this small before. So I feel like, and everyone does attribute it to the higher frequency of Ks being run. So there's definitely discussion there. And I feel like this round kind of was a microcosm of that effect, as I'm assuming for the Beckman team on the neg, you guys mentioned that you did not have a coach. I'm going to assume Ks are very unfamiliar to you because you are a new program who's probably not seen critiques before until you get to this level of the debate. And because you don't have a coach, no one has walked you through how to like break down the K and what to do in that stuff. So I assume that's pretty much a micro version of what's happening in parley today. So that's not really anything in my decision. That's just an interesting point of discussion that I found interesting for the round. But now let's talk about things that we could do differently. Let's start with the K here. So I think the framework level is fine. I'd recommend, there's like kind of a roll of the ballot you guys read at the end of your K, put it in the framework section and make it extremely explicit. It helps both your opponents and me as a judge. Literally say the roll of the ballot in this round is, and then whatever you want. Because the reason for that is when you get into situations like this where things start to get really messy, you can always go back to the roll of the ballot because that's literally telling the judge what the implications of voting for a team is in this round. And I feel like doing that, just no matter what situation you're in, will always help you in the debate, especially because then judges... The problem without a roll of the ballot is if a judge doesn't buy your alternative, you're kind of screwed because the judge can just be like, oh, I don't think this alt solves for their impacts. I'm not going to vote for it. And you get screwed there. So definitely make sure the roll of the ballot, it's always the safest thing to have in your K, and it's always essential. Besides that, your framework, like, it's the, you know, the usual good stuff, you know, fiat isn't real, all that. I got you. Link level. So I'm actually impressed because usually when people read Ks, it doesn't actually link into the topic because they're just reading a file, and you guys actually did topical links. I'm so happy for you. Thank you guys. Thank you so much. And I do want to bring this up for specifically for the neg, since we talked about like you're not allowed in Parley to like read a pre-written thing. What a lot of teams do that read Ks is they do have a pre-written K, but it doesn't have links because the topic changes every round. And so in their 20 minutes, they speed type out the framework, the impacts, and the alternative. And then after that, they think of their links and they write their links in during the 20 minutes, which is in the rules. So they did not actually violate the rules in this round. Ks being allowed in Parley is a different discussion, but like on the literal rule book sense, they didn't mess up anything. And I mean, should you ever want to run a K, that's what you do. Just like, you have your file, write it down, get the links in, all good. The links themselves for this specific K, I do think work, especially because your alternative is about rejecting traditional debate and the assumptions within it. It works well with your framework here. Like if this was a more like standard, like, I don't know, I guess a cap K would be the best example. But if this was like a more standard K where your alternative didn't have to deal with our unique position towards rhetoric and stuff like that, I would probably ask you to choose different links because your links have to do with the bank's mindset and stuff. But for this works, specifically the systemic nature of the banks. I'll talk about how the EU plays into this with them being like the leaders in gender equality in a minute. But for now, the links do work on their own. On the impact level, these are all good impacts. My only thing here, and this is with the alternative, is, and I see a lot of teams do this, is you have pre-fiat alternative, pre-fiat framework, pre-fiat everything, but these post-fiat impacts here. Not that doesn't like screw you over or anything, not in this round, but just like the other team, it's very easy for them to stand up here and be like, how does your alternative actually solve for this? Like on a micro level, it probably does, but like if you're the neg, let's pretend that I was on the neg team. My first response would be, Judge, their impacts are on dehumanization, emboldening discrimination, these tools of oppression, and their solution is we're going to think about how we use our words. That's an L. So just for the future, either I think the better way to do it, I think this works best with, you should have only done your tools of oppression. That should have been your main impact. And the way you want to frame it is that using rhetoric is, and you kind of make this already, but like really hammer home, the rhetoric are the tools of oppression, and our first step to deconstructing it is by having us let go of these tools of oppression and move away from it. That's the significance of reconsidering our rhetoric. The moment you do that, it's now like you're good. Like your alternative does solve for the impacts. I even wrote in my ballot, like, I'm not too sure if the alternative actually solves for these impacts, but I think that's the better way to do it. And then on the alternative itself, it's fine. You're good. All right, let's talk about neg. So first neg speech, this is where things start to get interesting. The first recommendation I have, because you actually decide to read your contention and all that, make sure no matter what. So first off, just this is something that you probably wouldn't know, but it's usually not recommended to read contentions against a K. But if you're going to do that, what you need to do, and this is the strategy I recommend you do next time you hit a K and you're running contentions, their second framework point is that fiat is not real. You need to explode on that and explain why either one, fiat is real, or you probably won't win that, but what you can win is that fiat is a really good thing. In doing that, suddenly, I can now evaluate your contention because, yeah, sure, fiat might not be real, but you've given me all these different reasons why, as a judge, I should still like fiat in the first place. And then I can go there, and now you're on equal footing with this K here, and you are in a much easier spot to debate the rest of this round. However, you responded to their access to education, and obviously it's good to respond to like anything in the K, but just for the future, if you want to go and win on the contention, you need to make sure that this point on fiat being not real gets diminished, because right now, like, trust, there is good stuff on this contention. I freaking love this contention. It was really smart. Like the way that you like had them like link into the K post fiat with like how like women like specifically get discriminated against with like all that different. That is so smart. That is really, really good analysis, but it is all post fiat, which means that I have to look at this K before I look at those arguments there. But the moment that you take down the fiat is not real or say fiat is good, boom, you like, the way this round worked, if you convince me that fiat is good, I think you win on that argument. And it's not that close at that point because that links them in really hard. And also because post-fiat and pre-fiat are on the same level now, you guys are so farther ahead. So that definitely do that for next time. But let's talk about what you actually did. So on the accessing education, we already discussed about like should K debate be in Parley or not. Talked about how they didn't actually violate the Parley rules. In terms of establishing profit by reading a K as like to leverage themselves above, I personally don't read this response, and the reason why is because, let's be honest, we don't know like the intentions of the other team. It's very true that they could. There's plenty of times where I've seen teams read one and I'm like, oh my God, you don't care. You just did that to make me lose. I'm pissed. That happens so much. But there also are teams that just like, don't want to debate the topic, especially like they mentioned, like this one shoehorns us into reading rhetoric that is harmful and stuff like that. We don't know. So I wouldn't make that response just to play it safe. I do understand where the response comes from, and I'm actually really sympathetic towards it because that's how I felt about K's starting out. But moving forward, just like steer clear of it so that we don't get into, because like if you think about it, there's a ton of ways to beat K's, and I'll get into that, by the way. But for now, like when you question the intention of someone reading an argument, you get into like a different section of debate that people just don't like. So I just recommend steering clear of that in the future. Okay. They're inherently like homophobic and transphobic by not using their pronouns and this whole thing. If it really caused anyone discomfort and it really was a violation of the equity briefing, which I kind of listened to, but I didn't memorize everything. I'm going to leave that to your discretion to do what you want post round with that. If you do want to do anything, I'm personally not going to do anything. All I will say is that for AF, I personally don't necessarily see a problem with not asking for pronouns. I think it's a really good practice. And I do recommend it. But not a reason to vote you guys down, I don't think, at least for me. And the reason why is because how are they supposed to know, right? And this is where what I recommend for neg is, and I don't know if you know how to do this, but some theory would be really nice. And the reason for theory is because, one, you can establish norms. So you can read a theory shell that talks about how you should be asking for pronouns before rounds and stuff, because we're now setting a norm where if people are comfortable, they are allowed to share, and that's a really good thing. But because they didn't know, and also because I don't think you ask them for their pronouns. Not that that was a problem or anything, but just like, how are they supposed to know, right? They don't know. So at that point, I'm not going to vote a team down because they didn't know to do something that they wouldn't have known before the round. And also, if you guys are curious, pronouns do show up in your emails pairings. Like they'll say like, hey, Beckman uses like these pronouns and all that. Just like, yeah, it's cool stuff. Okay, then on the whole being like sexist because of the gender of the team, the reason why this response is like, I understand where it's coming from. My thing is that their K has to deal with rhetoric surrounding the topic, not the team. This is a great response if they say the neg said this and this is sexist. It's like, yeah, it's two dudes against a guy-girl team that, like, no, you're not winning that. But because they're talking about how the topic would make them say that, ultimately, they're not inherently being sexist. The way they would is if they leveraged misogyny against you two, which they didn't end up doing in this round. Now let's get to what I think is the most interesting response to this, which is the EU is the gender equity leader. this is a really good response. I actually like it a lot. And I think you can go a lot further with this, actually. The reason why this got a little like wonky for me in terms of how I evaluate it is because the AF is not necessarily talking about the EU in its entirety. They are talking about specifically banks. And if you like look at their links, they talk about how banks are structured in specifically the European Central Bank, how it's structured, how it's historically been used, and that's patriarchal. It would be a response that destroys their K if they were like, the EU is misogynist, here's 10 reasons why. Then yeah, you can just be like, hey, they're the leader in gender equity. Like what are you guys talking about? Then done. But because they're talking about the historic use of specifically banks and not the EU in its entirety, this is a good response, but not specifically for the link story that they give us in this case. Then on taking partly education away, this is why I recommend reading theory, is because theory usually can link into education and fairness and so much that you get so much more playing ground with theory. And actually, that's what I was about to say. So I mentioned earlier, if you want to read contentions, you have to like disprove fiat being not real and all that. What's usually recommended against Ks is either 1, read a K against the K, 2, read theory against the K, or 3, read a disadvantage to the K. I'll talk about direct K responses in a second, but like I definitely recommend some theory. And if you don't know how to do that, I'd be happy to explain it after this. Okay, then pretty much the rest of this debate's mostly on the K sheet, especially because I evaluate that first since both teams conceded to fiat not being real. So the rest of this debate's down on the K. So MG stands up here, talks about not disclosing pronouns is not inherently homophobic. Yep. How the other team was like insulting and all that. I'm like sympathetic to that argument. Like no one wants to be called homophobic, but at the same time, I like understand like where like the emotional like grounding of that response was. So like I didn't count it against either team or anything. Like it was just unpleasant for everyone, but we're going to learn how to make proper responses, and that's okay. I didn't drop anyone on like accidentally offending the other team. Just I tried to stay as close to the flow as I could for this round. So ultimately here, what are a couple other things I want to do? All right. I want to quickly talk about most of this stuff was just a back and forth about like not necessarily insults, but just like general like rhetoric and usage and everything. Here's one thing. I'm going to talk about some strategies that they could have done to absolutely wreck this K in like a couple like seconds. And then after that, I'm going to talk about some things for AF to play it safer next time you run into a situation like this. And then ultimately how I voted. Neg, you made a couple of responses. I feel like if they were more fleshed out, I would have easily, it would have been GG's right there. I think your best response, I'm going into your relinks right now. So you read a couple. One of them was the elitist relink on them assuming that you have a coach, that assumption. Yes, AF, don't make assumptions about the other team ever. That not a good look. But the problem with this is that you need to, for Neg, you really need to warrant how this relinks in, because remember, their K is about specifically the dynamic between gender and how that functions specifically in the banking system. Yes, elitism is a part of that, but you need to warrant to me how them being elitist is them not rejecting the rhetoric that they are trying to avoid because of the fact that misogyny is a derivative of elitism, because it's a imbalanced power dynamic. That is what you need to say in order for me to buy the relink. The second thing you need to do for me to buy the relink is you need to tell me why a relink is worse than a link in, because at this point, they do link you in because you did read the contention, which means you talk about the European Central Bank and all that, which means you now link into the K. So what happens when both teams link into the K? You got to explain why they're better. The way I like to do this is where I go, a relink in will always be worse than a link in because they knew the harms of the K and they still did it. It's like comparing manslaughter to murder. That is usually what most people will say. And what you do is now this means as long as you win a single relink, it's over. That they lost on the K. That's it. So that was, I feel like if you took those extra steps, you could have won there. However, that's not even your best relink in. I want to talk about my absolute favorite argument that you made in this round, which was this savior complex argument. And I thought it was so freaking good. And I think if you full sent it, you could have easily like destroyed them on the flow. The savior complex argument is the argument you made where these are two men discussing about ways to disrupt misogyny and the patriarchy. And I feel like in the second neg speech, if you spent like 6 minutes on this, I think you win it. Like, and that's also, by the way, just a tip for everyone, full send one thing, like collapse hard on what you're winning and just go for it. I know the rest of the flow is messy. There's floating offense everywhere. Full send one thing, because I guarantee you, if you spend 6 minutes on it, and as long as the other team doesn't spend that much time on it, you're probably winning that argument. And for neg, I think that comes in the savior complex argument. I think the strategy you make is talk about how they literally relink into their own K, and they can't solve their own K by relinking in through the savior complex thing here. Explain out the savior complex, one, how they did it, which you did, but then the next steps, explain how that means they're not even doing their own alt, which means all their impacts are not being solved for. So now no one's winning anything. No one's solving for misogyny, and they relink in, which is even worse. And if you just spend like 6 minutes, you don't even need to go fast at this point. You just explain each thing step by step. The round is over. As soon as you win a relink on the K, they lose. And there is nothing they can do again. They can't outweigh it. They can't. The only strategy they have to do is they have to disprove the relink. And when you spend freaking 6 minutes of a speech on that, and then in the last speech for the reply and the neg, you spend even more time on it, they just do not have enough time to respond to it because it's only a 5-minute speech. They lose the round right there. That is the strategy for how the round played out. That is what you should have done. I can go into like general K responses here because there is a bunch, but for how this round played out, that's the best strategy. On AF, for like the last speech and all that, I think your responses to what they went for was fine. The only recommendation I have is make sure that you're extending all the necessary parts. I do think you do this for the most part, but like there could be more work done. So like, for example, in the last speech, I barely get framework extensions done, and you need to make sure that you have like how I'm even viewing this round in there. There is some there, but like you definitely need to like remind the judge like, hey, remember judge, this is the whole reason why we're doing this right now, XYZ. Make sure there's at least, usually when you're running a K, last speech, get one, just extend one link and extend your strongest link. For you, I feel like your strongest link in this is going to be the, I would say, I would probably do the whole perception of something weaker than you are with the policy making, the gendered policy. I think that's your strongest link. I think you full send that one. What you did was fine. Just if like, let's pretend that the neg like is really experienced with defending Ks and they like ripped apart each level of the K. You need to go hard on one link, and that is the link you go hard on. Then on the impacts, just extend one. You like kind of extended like your first 3 together. You were like, yeah, dehumanization, emboldening, discrimination, tools of oppression. Like, yeah. And obviously like those are extended, just like full send one. And then the alternative, and this is something that I know was confusing in the round because I know neg, you said you didn't hear an alternative. I personally did. I know the AF did. They extended it in all 3 speeches too. For AF, I guess just to make it not like easier for your opponents, but I guess more equitable, just be like the alternative is, which you kind of said, but just like always be explicit when it's like a big part of the K. Ultimately, this was like a weird decision. It was hard to make because the interactions were very awkward in this round in terms of argumentation and stuff. So pretty much all I have to look at here is the K. If the AF wins it without relinking, they win the round. That's how it works. Do they do that? There are relinks here, but do I buy them? Because you did not take all the steps, I don't necessarily buy the relinks. So at the very least, they don't lose on their K. So now it's, do they win their own K? If they do, they win the round. If they don't, neg wins the round because neg doesn't technically have to win anything. They just have to make AF not win anything. Do they win the K? So like, again, I don't know if your alternative does solve for your impacts, but because of the line by line, I do think you, at the very least, because the alt is uncontested, you're solving for something at the very least. So I do end up buying the alt reluctantly. I think this was a super close debate. I think it was pretty messy, but you two, technically, your framework is still there. You do have links into the neg. The impacts are present, and the alt is uncontested. I don't think the alt is that good, but because of the way this was handled, I do end up buying the K, and I will sign my ballot for the K there. Now, for education, I can talk about how to respond to Ks, since I think that would probably help everyone maybe. Because this round wasn't that pleasant, though, if you need to like leave or anything right now, go for it. But otherwise, I'm happy to explain like how to run theory, how to respond to Ks, whatever you all need. But yeah, good round, everyone. It was definitely a high level round at the very least. I'll say that much. Like, it's very obvious that you all are like going to break and all that tomorrow. Yeah. So there you go.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And you guys did a fantastic job. So really good luck with the rest of the tournament. Yeah, I think we both break. I think they're breaking all 4-2 teams at least. So.